Editor's Take. I'm Sakshi Batra, and with me is Gaurav Choudhary, is the Deputy Executive Editor of Moneycontrol, and we are going to be talking about government's latest push for electric vehicles with the announcements that were made in the union budget. Thanks a lot, Gaurav, for joining in. A whole host of incentives have been announced to push the electric vehicle space in the union budget of 2019 as well. There have been income tax rebates as well on the interest paid for loans for electric vehicles. Do you think this will really boost the demand that the government really wants from customers?
See, demand is one part of it, but what the government has said is that it has clearly demonstrated its intent that it wants India to turn into a global electric mobility hub.
Sure.
And that is why the government is taking the initiative. So, for instance, if there are tax incentives being given for people buying cars,
Yes.
it's meant that if bringing down the effective price of the car. Likewise, if there are investment incentives being given for companies, it is basically inducing and encouraging for, companies to set up manufacturing plants and basically
Yes.
increase manufacturing electric cars here.
Right, right.
But the big thing is that the government will have to take the lead. It is very much like how investment works in public finance. If there is a drop in private investment, or if private investment is depressed, essentially government investor that crowds in private investment. In this case, the government usage of electric vehicles will have to move faster.
Yes.
To demonstrate that this is something that's a workable solution for urban mobility, and for eventually individuals will then move towards it.
Right.
There are two things here. One is of charging infrastructure,
Sure.
which is a critical challenge.
Absolutely.
The government has now showed the way. It has the Prime Minister's office, for instance, has set up the largest number of charging infrastructure within the office,
Yeah.
followed by finance ministry and 2-3 other ministries, and also there are 2 charging infrastructure stations inside Gujarat Bhavan in Delhi. So the government has showed this is a way of telling the world, telling people that this government is moving more and more vehicles of its own fleet into the electric space,
Sure.
and people should follow.
Absolutely.
And once the public infrastructure is being charging infrastructure is set up by the government within its premises, private ones will come up.
Yes.
That is one part of it. The other part of it is that to ensure that how does public transport fleet move into it?
Yes.
Now, we know that for every incremental electric bus that the Delhi government will buy, probably, they are thinking of making it an electric bus.
Right.
So every incremental DTC bus that the Delhi government will buy, there is a possibility that that bus will probably be an electric bus. But
Yes.
you need charging infrastructure for that. And in the plan that the government is drawing and is going to execute, is in the final analysis in about 3 years from now, the government plans to, what we hear is that in a 50 to 100 kilometer range, there is going to be a charging infrastructure,
Right.
which is going to be big, of a very large scale, so that buses and trucks, etc., can actually move in and get their vehicles charged.
Sure.
Eventually, that kind of infrastructure will have to come in the private living space.
Right.
So big high-rise housing societies, for instance, will either have to be induced through some kind of tax incentive or something of that sort,
Right. Right.
or it has to be done through some kind of a decree that every parking space will need to have a charging infrastructure in place. I see a lot of noise initially, and then a lot of policy action on that front in the coming years. But
Right.
one thing is sure, that the government wants proportionately a large number of fleet, both public and private, to move towards electric mobility.
Right. And you rightly pointed out that charging infrastructure has been the biggest impediment, because everybody has been thinking, when there is nothing like that on the ground right now, how can we move towards moving towards complete e-mobility in, say, 8 years or 10 years from now, for sure. But the announcements made in the budget have also reduced the customs duties and tax exemptions on the components of electric vehicles, so that investors could be encouraged to make them in India. So do you think that will happen eventually?
So the whole idea of doing that is to ensure that car makers are actually encouraged
Yeah.
to move their electric vehicle manufacturing facility to India. And once that moves, it is like moving from an old carburetor engine to an MPFI engine. That was a big innovation that happened in automobile industry. Every car now is an MPFI engine, so we don't have a carburetor engine any longer.
Okay.
Likewise, if car manufacturers actually start producing more and more of their incremental vehicles or the new models in the electric space, it will only create a new market. And the new market, as I have said many times before, in India there is a peculiarity of the automobile market.
Yes.
The decision to buy a car is as much dependent on the price of the car as much it is dependent on its resale value. So, and it's like a chicken and egg story. If you have a large number of cars moving on roads, on Indian roads, which are of electric engines, I think that will create a self-perpetuating cycle of creating a replacement market. So the replacement market will come with a lag. People will not have to wait for a replacement market to be created alongside a complete new innovation.
Sure.
So electric mobility first the government will have to demonstrate that public fleet moves into electric mobility. More and more public transport moves into electric vehicles. For instance, if aggregators are set a targets at about, say, in 5 years from now, 40% or 60% of the fleet will have to be necessarily of electric vehicle, then that is a large part of the problem solved. Because if you see 60% of all Uber and Ola vehicles running on electric fleet, that is a huge number of cars on the roads which are of electric. So that itself will create a replacement market and also it'll create enough pressures for charging infrastructure to come up.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to understand, for the infrastructure building, who is going to be creating that? Is it going to be the central government, the state government? Is it going to be a PPP model or a private entity that we are encouraging that they should come up and set up all this?
So there are 3-4 models that will probably, which I foresee. One is that the government itself is going to set up, like the one we saw in the case when CNG was brought in Delhi about 20 years ago. When it first came, and it was the transition was chaotic, and it was expected to be chaotic because the infrastructure was not in place. And the first couple of years, you could see long queues of buses, DTC buses, actually waiting to get tanked up with gas. But then charging infrastructure eventually came, and now it is almost seamless. Likewise, in the electric vehicle space, I expect the government to first set up charging infrastructure, followed by private parties setting up charging infrastructure in public spaces, and this specific public spaces where there is a large concentration of cars. So I would say, for instance, if it's a metro station, and if that particular metro station has a parking facility, and we have many of them in Delhi, where cars can be parked for a price and taken away in the evening, where many people do that. They drive down to the metro station, park it there, and go back when they come back from office. So all these parking facilities probably will end up having electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and I expect most of these to be leased out to private parties. And we know for a fact that in Hyderabad this is being talked about very actively, and you can also expect the power utilities, the state-owned power utilities like NTPC, etc., getting very heavily into developing electric charging infrastructure. That is in the PPP space. But there is also a private space. So you could come up with models where people have land alongside road, and that land probably can be leased out for setting up a charging infrastructure.
Because acquiring of land is also a big issue.
Acquiring of land is a big issue. So if people who own that land can be made, can be involved in the creation of charging infrastructure through an inducement, which is commercial in nature, that will go a long way in developing this rapidly.
Right, absolutely. Thanks a lot then, Gaurav, for sharing all that insight. Well, the government has clearly shown its intent to moving towards electric vehicles. In the budget also, a whole host of announcements and incentives were announced for electric vehicle space as well. And going forward, we could see the government taking the first steps and actually turning public transport first into electric vehicles, and then more and more private players could be invited into it, as well as customers also could be encouraged to buy electric vehicles with a whole host of incentives, just like how tax rebates have also been announced. For the infrastructure space, again, we will have to see which kind of models will the government follow in the days to come. Thanks a lot for joining us in this edition of Editor's Take, and do stay logged on to moneycontrol.com for more news and updates. Thanks for watching.